Okay. All right, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Catherine Steins. I'm the Associate Head of School here at Westover, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Head of School Book Talk featuring the infamous Bruce Coffin. Let's give him a round of applause. As is often the case in school life, and one of the reasons associate heads of school exist, I am stepping in for our head of school, Polly Fredlund, for this introduction. While Polly is indeed magical, she even cannot be in two places at once, and I'm honored to make this introduction. The Head of School Book Club meets several times a year to engage in thoughtful dialogue with faculty, authors, and special guests. Today, we're especially pleased to welcome back Bruce Coffin, a treasured former faculty member who began his time at Westover in 1976 as an English teacher. Bruce returns today to guide you in a discussion, A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, a beautifully understated novel first published in 1978. It is a fitting choice for someone who has long helped students and colleagues alike find meaning in language, history, and human connection. My doctoral dissertation is about exceptional teachers, and in my short time here at Westover thus far, to hear Bruce's name over and over again from our alumni is a testament to his work here, and I'm so thrilled he's here to join us today. Bruce, it's all yours.
All right, well, I suppose this talk should be called something like The Adventures of a Literary Pilgrim, because that's kind of what it's all about. It's a little bit of what I have been doing since I first discovered the book in question, called A Month in the Country by the English writer J.L. Carr. Here he is here. I have a kind of book of photos of things that I'll be talking about that I've handed out up there. Yesterday, Chris Sweeney and I went through a pretty extensive essay that I'd written on this subject, and we managed to edit it and cut it down, whittle it down enough so that I hope by the end of this presentation there'll be time for questions and comments. So, okay, here we go. Well, at a little over 100 pages in its first edition, and thus kind of more of a novella than a novel, A Month in the Country, as you know, tells the story of Tom Birkin, a shell-shocked veteran of the Great War who travels to North Riding in Yorkshire in the summer of 1920 to uncover a 14th century mural which has been whitewashed over on the wall of a church in the village of Oxgodby, which is a fictional place as it turns out. Birkin's a survivor of the trenches with a facial tic and shattered nerves, and a survivor as well of a failed marriage. His stay extends from the moment of his arrival in a drenching rain in the tiny village of Oxgodby, and he lives there in the tower of the church while he's carrying out his first commission in restoration. His stay in Oxgodby extends from the moment of his arrival to the time several weeks later when the first signs of autumn bring to an end a long run of unseasonably good weather. During this time, he experiences a gradual recovery, a renewal of hope and purpose as a result of his labors and of his absorption in the rhythms of rural life and his personal relationships, including a kind of fleeting love affair. I discovered the book at the old Foundry bookstore in New Haven, Connecticut in 1981 when I first saw the American paperback edition, and here it is, and this is the copy that I bought, as a matter of fact. In the front bookcase of that store, reserved for store owner Henry Berliner's must-reads. It was a small bookcase of the best books that he'd read, and he was insisting all his customers purchase and read too. When I picked it up to look it over, Henry said, "It's a wonderful book. I've sold 50 copies already. You might as well make it 51. So a short time later, when I was next in the store, I told him he'd been right. It was one of the best books I'd ever read. And thus began for me my 25-year obsession with that book that included buying it for many friends, recommending it to dozens of others, for some of whom it became as treasured a possession as it is for me, and as a teacher inviting my students over a number of years to join me in trying to fathom its peculiar power and its integrity as a work of art. Although it won the Guardian Prize and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1980, and it didn't, they gave the Man Booker Prize that year to a pretty average novel by William Golding, which I think was a make-up call. I think it was called, I can't even remember the name of it now, but it's one of those things. I think they felt that they'd passed Golding over in the past, and so they were going to make up for the misjudgments, and so Carr didn't get it anyway. But in spite of the fact that it won the Booker Prize, I discovered that A Month in the Country remained pretty obscure for many years following the publication, as did Carr himself. Nobody had ever heard of J.L. Carr. And even there in England, I mean, nobody knew him. When I was at Malvern College in 1986 and 1987 in Worcestershire, I was asked to select a book for the winter meeting of the Gleaners, which was the college's well-established literary society. And the tradition was to invite one of the members of the faculty to choose a work of literary merit which would be read by everyone in the society in preparation for an evening of discussion and refreshment hosted by the sponsor. When I announced A Month in the Country as my choice, I learned to my astonishment that none of them had ever heard of it. And the Gleaners included a really well-established group of Oxonians and Cantabrigians in the English, history, economics, and classics departments, and they'd never heard of the book. It was easily available in Penguin Classic paperback edition and short enough to guarantee that everybody would have read it completed it by the time of the discussion. The meeting took place on a snowy January evening at Furze Cottage, which was where Maria and I and our children were residing that year. And it was a kind of historic occasion for the Gleaners. First of all, it was so well attended in spite of the weather that we had to move in chairs from all over the place. The room was full to overflowing. And more importantly, the convocation, the meeting there, did not, as the wine and beer flowed, become an occasion for settling personal and interdepartmental vendettas. I found out afterwards that that's usually what happened in those meetings. In fact, for the first time that anyone could remember, all the readers were in agreement about the book, united in their conviction that it was, in the words of English Department Chairman John Venning, quote, an absolute tour de force. And a disinterested and interesting discussion of its mysteries and its merits filled the long evenings meeting. It was similarly received later that year by my section of the top dozen fourth formers being groomed to select English as one of their A-level subjects. As a book with echoes of trench warfare, narrated by an old man alone with his memories, and as a kind of love story set in a strange countryside over a summer that goes on and on, it instantly appealed to adolescent boys in an all-male boarding school waiting to break out for the summer holidays. In fact, Birkin's experience touched them so deeply as to inspire one boy to seek me out after class and ask my advice about the girl that he had not yet summoned the nerve to approach. Me? And one of his classmates, a Welshman named David Elias, when he visited me later in Connecticut after graduating from Cambridge, reported actually meeting J.L. Carr himself at a talk he gave at King's College and telling him of his introduction to the book and his great admiration of it as well. And that was the first time I had come in touch with anybody who had met Carr himself. My search for information about Carr and the world of the novel began in earnest later that year when I was in Malvern, when my wife and two children and I spent our spring break with an old friend, Leslie Cooper, and her mother at their home in Great Langton, Yorkshire, a little village of 52 people. And that was, of course, J.L. Carr territory for the setting of a month in the country. After some discussion with them, some time spent over maps, I set off in search of the setting and something therein of the spirit of the novel. It was easy enough to discover the Kilburn White Horse. You'll have pictures of it there in the album. The massive figure cut into the hillside of the North York Moors National Park. And with my wife and children, it was easy to make our way up the steep path along its front to the meadow above where Birkin went with the Methodists by horse and wagon for their annual church outing at the end of the harvest in that novel. And with Ripon Cathedral, which Carr describes as that great rambling barn of a building, end quote, that Birkin visits on the day he and the deputation of Methodists go to the piano and organ warehouse to try out second-hand organs. Great comic episode in the novel. It was the cathedral that day was almost as quiet as he himself found it. And he says in the novel, you remember, but for an ancient verger pottering about, I had the great forest of stone all to myself, and for an hour pottered and marveled with him, end quote. But other places from the novel proved more elusive. We were to discover no Ox Godby. The closest we came was an impressive country house made of stone and bearing the name of Osgodby Hall, which is there in the album, which may or may not have been Carr's inspiration for the name of his fictional village. Nor could we find a North Yorkshire church that perfectly matched the description of the one where Birkin undertakes his first job of restoration. The best, then, that I could carry away from my first efforts was a kind of memorable composite of external and internal features gathered from a number of sites, and we really did get around to a lot of churches. In wandering around North Yorkshire, I was exploring the country of Carr's youth. To track him down and to find out more about his life and his sources of inspiration, I would eventually need to go to the town of Kettering in Northamptonshire, where he had come in 1952 to fill the position of head of school and to teach at Highfields Primary School. He occupied that position for 30 years and spent the rest of his life there. My visit to Kettering did not happen for more than a decade, during which time I continued teaching a month in the country to my AP students at Westover and managed to read all of Carr's other novels and anything else I could discover that had been written about him and them. But finally, having learned of a J.L. Carr collection in Kettering Library, I wrote to them for information in 2001 and then received a grant from Westover that would enable me to go to England for research during my spring break. On arriving by train in Kettering in March of 2001, I was feeling myself to be somewhat in Birkin's position, a stranger come to discover what I could about a great work of art and its creator. The town itself, once known primarily for its footwear industry, is unremarkable. I'd written to Kettering's head librarian to be sure that the Carr collection would be accessible, and I found the staff welcoming enough and helpful. And after 2 days of reading newspaper clippings about the author and perusing magazine and newspaper articles by and about him, taking notes on interviews he had given and making ample use of the photocopy machine, I was told by the head librarian about someone he thought I would like to meet. So the next day, a Mr. Frank Foles, who had been Carr's next-door neighbor, came to the library, and we had a long talk that ended with his inviting me back to his house. On the way there, we stopped off at Kettering Parish Church, where, among other things, Mr. Foles pointed out to me above the north door Carr's statues of St. Peter and St. Paul, which he had carved to replace the ones destroyed at the Reformation. I had come to understand that Carr, as well as being a schoolmaster and an author of 8 novels, was an accomplished painter and sculptor and also a publisher. Over a cup of tea, Mr. Foles and his wife, Doreen, showed me the Carr treasures they had acquired, which included prints of some of his paintings done in a variety of materials and styles, a few of the country maps he had drawn and illustrated, and I have 4 or 5 of those framed on the wall of my house in Woodstock in Connecticut. They're about this wide and maybe this high, and they're really quite lovely. The illustrations and whatnot on those county maps, and some of the pocket-sized 16-page books he had produced, editions of famous English poets. Here's one of Tennyson and one of Wordsworth. And then he wrote some quirky histories, including Carr's Dictionary of English Kings, Consorts, Pretenders, Usurpers, Unnatural Claimants, and Royal Aethelings. The Poor Man's Guide to the Revolt of 1381, The History of England by a Partial and Ignorant Historian, and his famous and fictional Carr's Dictionary of Extraordinary English Cricketers, which was such a success that it was reputedly a favorite of Prince Charles, now King Charles, that after Carr's retirement, it enabled him to avoid going back to school mastering and to begin writing novels. The royalties on this thing alone were so great that it made him a pile of money. And it is an extraordinary book in its way. One of its most famous entries, and one of the ones that King Charles liked the most, was Sir Winston Churchill, and it says of him, did not play cricket. After tea, a walk up the Foles driveway enabled us to look at the house and property of 27 Milldale Road, which had belonged to the Carr family, Joseph Lloyd and his wife Sally and their son Bob. The windows of the second floor at the back, pictured in my collection there, were those of the small bedroom that housed the Quince Tree Press, Carr's one-man publishing enterprise, established to turn out the maps and the small books. And in the back garden, as you'll see in the book there, was a small greenhouse where Carr had written some of his novels. During our talk, the Folds made me a present of 2 of his illustrated Carr maps, for which their daughter had done some of the hand painting, and some copies of the pocketbooks of English poets. Back at the library in the car, just as I was about to say goodbye to Frank, he spoke more personally about his former neighbor, and he told me in a very confidential tone that there was someone else I might wish to meet while I was in Kettering. The family friend of the Carrs who offered Jim, as he preferred to be called, a place in her home and took care of him during his final illness. And he offered to call her and find out whether she would be willing to meet me. And at that point I had this sense of working in, moving closer to the life of this intriguing and, as I was beginning to understand, essentially very, very private man. Haelwyn Sidoni Cox was a lovely white-haired Welsh woman who was, at that time, I'm guessing, in her early 70s. She and her husband had met the Carrs in 1952 and had become friends of theirs. By the time of Carr's wife's death in 1983, Mrs. Cox, or Haelwyn, as I came to call her, had been a widow for some years, and eventually she and Jim began spending time at her house until his death. She was a gracious and friendly person who was interested in my obsession with A Month in the Country, which had brought me all the way from America to Kettering in search of what I could learn about it and its author. And in her bright and comfortable sitting room over another cup of tea, I settled into what she told me had been Jim's favorite chair. And we began by talking about the man himself. She readily agreed with Frank Folds' assurance that he was unconventional. Under his school supervision, no student was ever singled out as the cleverest. If there were to be prizes, then everyone would receive one. On sports day, he invented an arithmetic race so that anyone who was hopeless at sports could have a chance to achieve some recognition. When the cherry trees on a nearby council estate were in blossom, he would march all the students out to recite Haussmann's loveliest of trees, the cherry now, is hung with blossoms all along the bough. The stream near the school might become the River Jordan, or a site of historic battle, or the place where he would have all the children launch bottles containing their names and addresses for the purpose of calculating their final place of arrival. None of his staff or his students ever forgot him. But he was, she maintained, and here she was again in agreement with Frank Folds and also, as I was to discover, with his friend and biographer Byron Rogers, not an easy man to get to know. He liked his own space, Haelwyn recalled. He was happy with people for a time, but then he wanted his own time and space. People found him quite secretive, and when asked about anything about himself, he was, quote, apt to turn the question to you and ferret out all sorts of information, as though, some feared, he was getting ready to make you a character in one of his novels. Byron Rogers opens his splendid biography, The Last Englishman, The Life of J.L. Carr, with a recollection from Carr's son, Bob, which was the Carr's only child. I'd walk down the road with him, and there'd be all these people saying, "Hello, Mr. Carr," and smiling as though they'd met an old friend. They'd perk up, and he'd perk up, and that was how he liked people, in short, sharp bursts. But I used to wonder which Mr. Carr they knew. I often didn't, and I was his son. As Halewyn Cox told me, he compartmentalized his life. There were so many people at his funeral who did not know each other. As we talked about J.L. Carr, the antiquarian, whose interest in country churches led to his campaign to preserve a number of them that had been declared derelict, the conversation shifted naturally to A Month in the Country and my attempts to find the places where the action of that novel is set. She looked out the window of her sitting room and remarked that if we left now, we might just have daylight enough for the church at Great Harrowden, which, I remembered, Carr even mentions in the novel. This, I felt, might be the place. And as we set off, armed with binoculars, for the short drive to that Northamptonshire village church, population 161 in North Harrowden, with its Norman church, All Saints, famous for its medieval wall painting, which Mrs. Cox told me had inspired the one in Carr's novel. Finding the church open, we had it to ourselves to look at what has become known as one of the best and most complete dooms, as they call them, Last Judgments, that is, remaining in England. Situated as Last Judgments always are above the chancel arch, this great painting sat very high up at clerestory level, hence the need for the binoculars. As described in an official notice about the church, quote, Christ sits on a rainbow and displays the wounds in his hands and sides. Kneeling beside and below the hands are clasped in prayer are the Virgin Mary, crowned as Queen of Heaven, and St. John the Evangelist. Also flanking Christ are two angels. Graves are opening. Some souls have already come out. Some are still inside their tombs, but upright in the act of rising at the sound of trumpets. The rising dead are confined to the left-hand side of the painting. The right-hand side is fully taken up with the fate of the damned. And there are several photographs of what I'm describing here. We had just enough time for a good look at it before dusk set in, but Mrs. Cox offered to come back with her camera and photograph it in better light and send me the pictures. We had agreed to begin a kind of correspondence so that I could ask further questions about Carr as they came up. And in the evening, as I was pondering the day's events and immersing myself once again in the novel, it seemed to me that I was slowly circling in on both the book and the author. In the center of the novel, and framing the events of the narrative, is a Last Judgment very similar to the one I'd just seen. In Birkin's words, the great spread of wall between chancel arch and roof timbers always got the big treatment, a judgment. Well, it's reasonable enough. Big casts need big stages, and the tall wall around the great arch could be arranged very appropriately with Christ in majesty at its apex, the falling curves nicely separating the smug souls of the righteous trooping off stage north to paradise, and the damned dropping normally head first into the bonfire, end quote. As the days pass and Birkin begins experiencing a feeling of kinship with its creator, the nameless man who'd stood there where I stood, conjuring and teasing back his work after 400 years of darkness, Birkin's own life is slowly reclaimed. Immersed in his labors and eventually in the life of Ox Godby, he gains an exhilarating sense of lengthening perspectives, of time both slowed and expanded during the long days of summer as, quote, this steady rhythm of living and working got into me, so that I felt part of it and had my place, a foot in both present and past. Birkin's immersion in both time present and time past is so complete as to draw him out of his suffering and isolation. As he, quote, finds his way back to the Middle Ages, end quote, his recollection that, quote, there was so much time that marvelous summer refers to more than the day following day of his fruitful labors and acknowledges the past times in which he loses himself to find himself. Indeed, the layering effect of the plot's mysteries, with their overlapping characters and events, both historical and contemporary, is part of the story of how Birkin's life is given back to him and how he consents to receive it. When he arrives in Oxgodby from London in the pouring rain, he feels that he is among hostile northerners, in an enemy country, as he says. But after he sleeps like the dead, quote unquote, on his first night in the church tower, and wakes to the task of bringing that long dead man's apocalyptic vision into daylight, the suggestion is that he may be able to bring himself back to life and, in the process, achieve at least a kind of perspective on his own nightmarish war experience. As he views from a window of his place in the church tower the landscape that has emerged from the rain and clouds of his arrival, he experiences a possible enlargement of vision, and I quote, "And then, God help me, on my first morning, in the first few minutes of my first morning, I felt that this northern countryside was friendly, that I'd turned a corner, and that this summer of 1920, which was to smolder on until the leaves fell, was to be a propitious season of living, a blessed time." However, Birkin's coming to terms with his own apocalypse is a gradual process. In the early days of his work, it is Moon, as he regards the painter's depiction of hell, who makes the first association. And Moon says, "Do you know, in some ways it brings back the whole bloody business in France, particularly the winters, those red evenings when the barrage was starting and each man wondered if it might be the night, and he shall come with wounds red to dame the quick and the dead." At this time, Birkin, who wishes simply to escape the nightmare, didn't see it like that. "No doubt I didn't want to," he says. "Oxgodby was another world. It had to be." End quote. But as more of the great painting is revealed, he discovers therein an angle of vision on the war and on his failed marriage. When Alice Keach, the lovely and lonely wife of the vicar, asks him whether he believes in hell, he thinks of Passchendaele, that horrible battle in World War I, in which so many soldiers on both sides drowned in the mud. And he tells her, "I've seen it and lived there. I have a map of hell in my head." And in the unspoken subtext of this conversation, which is marital unhappiness, Birkin thinks of his estranged wife in the same terms. Quote, "And there had been Vinnie. That had been a sort of hell." End quote. The increasing clarity with which he comes to view the nightmares of his past reveals the way his life is being resurrection by his immersion in his work. Standing there with Halwyn Cox in All Saints, Great Harrowden, while the light lasted, scanning with binoculars the judgment with particular attention to the figures of the damned plunging into hell, had been very much like sharing Birkin's absorption in the color and drama of the mural in the novel. As readers, I think we live those days with him up on the scaffolding as fully as we live any time and any place in literature. But the world of Oxgodby itself, which is just as fully realized as the interior of that small medieval church, and which also contributes to Birkin's recovery, is not, I had realized as we emerged from the church, to be found there in Great Harrowden and its environs, not to be found there at all in Northamptonshire, as a matter of fact. Not until 6 years later, when I returned to Kettering via Yorkshire, this time as a guest of Halwyn Cox's, to continue my search for Carr, was I shown the other church, which inspired the one in the novel. We drove 3.5 miles north of Kettering and out into the country, parked the car near some dilapidated farm buildings. Could they have been the prototypes for the hut behind the bushes where the Reverend Keach awkwardly suggests Birkin goes to answer the call of nature? We came upon a path, and suddenly there it was in the distance, the church alone in the meadows. St. Faith's, or St. Newton in the Willows, as it is called, was only there to be seen at all because of Carr's battle to save it from vandals and from the indifference of church authorities. Largely by his untiring effort, the building was restored and returned and turned into a field center for natural history studies, though, as Aylwin explained, Carr had wanted it preserved as a church. And today it is a center for environmental education, offering fieldwork opportunities to school groups and general interest courses for families and adults. Inside we saw no murals. There was no evidence of any when Carr first happened upon the place in its neglected state. But we found a busy administrative center which houses a laboratory and reference library and even provides a dormitory on the upper floors with beds to accommodate school children and research students. Still, without Carr's indefatigable, insistent efforts, the church either would have been pulled down or simply allowed to fall in. Outside Newton in the Willows, before we crossed the meadows on our way back to the car, I scanned the horizon and found in one direction something like what Birkin sees as he looks out the window in his makeshift living quarters in the church tower on its first morning in Oxgodby. Quote, more fields rising toward a dark rim of hills, and as it lightened a vast and magnificent landscape unfolding, end quote. Though I realized that these words describe not the Midland setting to be seen here. The action of A Month in the Country is set in this church in the fields, supplied with the murals of Great Harrowden, but situated in the magnificent North York landscape of Carr's youth. So it's a composite, you see. This is the world that draws Birkin out of himself, that North Yorkshire landscape. And it draws him out of himself and into the changing picture of Oxgodby itself as his time there unfolds. You remember he receives visits from Kathy Ellerbeck, the young daughter of the station master, and he accepts the hospitality and friendship offered by the Ellerbecks, modeled, by the way, on Carr's own parents and his sister Kathy, as they were in his childhood. And he lends a hand at getting in the harvest and joining farming families on their annual outing. And moments of, quote, letting summer soak into me, the smell of summer and the summer sounds are experiences of surrender to an Arcadian world, and his heightened receptivity to, quote, deep red hollyhocks pressed against a limestone wall, and velvet butterflies flopping lazily from flower to flower, a cloudless sky, ditches and roadsides deep in grass, poppies, cuckoo pine, trees heavy with leaf, orchards bulging over heavy briars, suggests the healing effects of this landscape. Even love, as Birkin finds it, grows and matures with the season and has its natural place in this idyll. Alice Keach, the vicar's wife, appears and is easily absorbed into the tenor of his life, as if she were some personifying spirit of summer. As Birkin has allowed himself to be surrounded by life, he can accept death once again. Having fallen into a deep sleep on top of a tomb in the churchyard, as was his custom, Birkin awakens in the midday stillness to her quiet presence, as if to some vision. Struck by her beauty, he likens her to Botticelli's Primavera, and notes the flight pattern of a butterfly, which seemed as though, quote, it might settle on a rose in her hat. As she comes to visit him more and more often while he works, their natural compatibility and slowly developing intimacy are revealed in a balance of silence and disclosure until the slow passage of the season brings about what might have been the consummation of their unspoken love. With his work of restoration all but completed, Birkin again awakens from his midday rest to find her waiting there with a bag of apples she's brought for him. She asks for the first time to be shown his living space in the tower of the church, and there, as they look out the window onto the landscape, she leans against him, and Birkin does not respond. Although she has a central place in this time when man and earth are one, when the pulse of living beats strong, when life is brimming with promise and the future stretches confidentially ahead, in Birkin's words, he allows the temptation scene to pass by failing to act and to accept the resolution thus offered. By the time he recovers from the devastation of his missed opportunity and goes searching for her in hopes of a second chance, she and her husband have left, departed without a trace. And their disappearance coincides with the sudden coming on of autumn and the realization that his work and his time in Ox Godby are finished. Even as the idol celebrates the fullness of life, it carries the reminder of the transient nature of all that is given. Shadows have crossed the summer days in the form of various memento mori, such as the felt presence of the dead benefactress Adelaide Hebron, as her bequests are carried out by moon. The photograph on a farmhouse mantelpiece of a young soldier lost in the war. And most notably, and I think ingeniously, the brief appearance of Emily Clough, a young friend of Kathy Ellerbeck's who is dying of consumption. Her pale face is accentuated by the luxuriance of nature as it catches Birkin's attention. Quote, "An apple tree grew outside her window, its boughs almost pushing into her room. The sun came through the leaves in a soft and burnished light." End quote. The day of the harvest outing, which for Birkin will always be the summer day of summer days, concludes with the news of Emily Clough's death. As an ongoing meditation on time, a month in the country carries a haunting sense of mutability, of time as both creator and destroyer. The predominant tone of wonder tinged with regret at Birkin's recollection of, quote, "those long days," is established early in the narrative. As he remembers meeting Charles Moon, he is momentarily overwhelmed by a sense of loss, and I quote, "God, when I think back all those years, and it's gone, all the excitement of that first job, Ox Godby, Kathy Ellerbeck, Alice Keach, Moon, that first season of calm weather, gone as though they'd never been." His memories of Alice Keach occasion his most poignant thoughts about time, as his lost opportunity can only be looked back on with deep regret. "I should have lifted an arm and taken her by the shoulder, turned her face and kissed her. It's why she'd come. Then everything would have been different. My life, hers." In Philip Larkin's words, the English poet, 20th century English poet Philip Larkin, "The long perspectives open at each instant of our lives link us to our losses and show us what we once had, blindingly undiminished, as though, by acting differently, we might have kept it so." The calling back of those far-off days as a season of both fulfillment and loss is underscored by repeated time references in the narrative of the much older Tom Birkin, who's telling the story. Speculating on what brought Kathy Ellerbeck so often to visit him in the church, he remarks, she had the sense to know a kindred spirit wasn't going to be on hand forever, and she must catch the fleeting moment ere it fled. And recalling that season and his wish that it would, quote, go on and on, no one going, no one coming, autumn and winter always loitering around the corner, summer's ripeness lasting forever. Birkin must also remember the first breath of autumn, a prodigal feeling, a feeling of wanting, taking, and keeping before it's too late. Even rhythms of bucolic life are not immutable in this novel, as Birkin acknowledges that summer of 1920 as, quote, the end of the horse age, and laments the last days of those great mythical creatures soon to disappear from highway and turning furrow, end quote. The elegiac tone of these recollections, with time itself as the subject of meditation, issues from the older Birkin's feeling of exile from a moment of youth. With reference to the possibility that some future might open from Ox Godby, he can only remark resignedly, well, I was young, and, well, we lived by hope. And the understood futility of thinking that somehow his time in Ox Godby might have been prolonged is one way of reconciling him to the life that followed Ox Godby and that failed to provide him with any such experience again. Quote, if I'd stayed there, would I always have been happy? No, I suppose not. People move away, grow older, die, and the bright belief that there will always be another marvelous thing around the corner fades. Birkin arrives in Ox Godby alone, and his solitary departure weeks later concludes the novel in such a way as to make clear that his only connection to that place and time is one of memory. All this happened so long ago, he muses, and I never returned, never wrote, never met anyone who might have given me news of Ox Godby. So in memory it stays as I left it, a sealed room furnished by the past. The self-containment and the incorruptibility of that season, as it is thus preserved, is supported by a narrative present completely unrepresented, and thus severed from the ongoing recollected time in which the action of the novel is set. The month in the country is then a sort of eternal moment that is so often both the inspiration for and the product of artistic endeavor. Indeed, it's consistent with Carr's sureness of touch that Birkin spends his last moment in Ox Godby contemplating the great painting of the Last Judgment, which, by his efforts, has been brought out of obscurity and back into time to reveal the medieval painter's vision of the end of history, in which all things temporal are assigned their place in eternity. In his last look at, quote, that great spread of color, end quote, he understands what he has accomplished. Quote, then I knew that whatever else had befallen me during these weeks in the country, I had lived with a very great artist, my secret sharer of the long hours I had labored in the half-light above the arch. And I felt the old tingling excitement and a sureness that the time would come when some stranger would stand there and understand, end quote. The recovery of the painting has brought about the recovery of Tom Birkin. One restoration has been the occasion of the other. The point of view here, which is at once both that of the artist and of the beholder, is recognized in Molly Painter Downes' characterization of the novel as, quote, a small hymn about art and the compensating joy of the artist, both in giving and receiving. Those final moments before a masterpiece as achieved vision may express J.L. Carr's as well as Birkin's sense of fulfillment and represent our full experience of aesthetic awareness and imaginative participation in the moment and in the entire novel. The effortless and perfectly natural way in which the conclusion speaks simultaneously for the protagonist, for the author, and for the reader underscores the integrity of the novel and recalls a moment from the beginning of Birkin's time in Ox Godby. At the end of a day's work of cleaning down the years to the painting itself, he says, he steps back to look at the breathtaking result and sees the emerging Ox Godby Last Judgment, quote, like all truly great works of art, hammering you with its whole before beguiling you with its parts. There before the painting, Birkin has a sense of, quote, the nameless painter reaching from the dark to show you what he could do, saying to me as clear as any words, quote, if any part of me survives time's corruption, let it be this. Such a work of art is J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country, which, as a meditation on time, art, and spiritual renewal and recovery, weaves its separate thematic strands into a seamless artistic whole. Those words may be taken as Carr's testament, and Birkin's experience here is very much that of the reader before what Byron Rogers, his biographer, recognizes rightly as Carr's, quote, masterpiece, a novel that comes as close to perfection and as anything written in our time. That night, after dinner, Halewyn Cox and I strolled through her back garden with its well-tended flowers and small collection of Carr statues placed along the paths. Then we finished the evening with more Carr talk. He had, Mrs. Cox recalled, rather liked the film that had been made of A Month in the Country, though none of it had been shot at Great Harrowden or Newton in the Willows. He thought Colin Firth as Birkin and Kenneth Branagh as Charles Moon had been the right choices. But confidentially, Halewyn said, he had felt that Natasha Richardson was not right for the part of Alice Keach. And she said, let's see, this surprised me, as Natasha Richardson came very close to how I had pictured that lovely young lady in the novel. She really did. I thought she was magnificent.
We're getting thunder and lightning, so I don't want anyone to get hit by thunder and lightning. I'm so sorry.
Okay, well.
How much longer do you have?
About a page and a half.
Okay, you're gonna brave it? Okay.
Not much longer. I thought Natasha Richardson was right for the part, especially with her face partly shadowed by that straw hat that she wore for a good part of it. Oh, Jim, Halewyn said, he was always mad about straw hats, and he'd tell me to go buy one and tie a scarf around it. There was, Carr had told her conventionally, a prototype for Alice Keach. And she had, he said, recognized herself in the novel. But he never let on to anyone who she was. Perhaps, Halewyn explained, she was the mysterious stranger who turned up at Carr's funeral. As Byron Rogers, the biographer, described it, quote, and then, at the very last minute, there was a clatter of high heels, and she came into the church, very young, very beautiful, in fashionable black. She came alone, and then was gone, just as abruptly into the March afternoon, so I never did find out who she was, ex-pupil, ex-mistress, protege, fan, or cricketer, end quote. And her identity's never been discovered. Our talk turned to one of the most compelling features of the novel, the narrator, Birkins, wistfully looking back years on that one summer. And Halwyn confirmed that the past went everywhere with Carr. When he was ill and could not sleep, he would recite to himself the names of the girls who were there in his older sister Kathy's field hockey team picture from her school days. They were among the baggage he carried from his early years, none of which he ever let go of, she said. One of Halwyn's 2 guest rooms, and I was given a choice, had been Carr's room during the time he stayed there, and my bed was the one that he had occupied during his final months. Before I went to sleep that night, I took from the bookcase the copy of the novel's first edition that he had given her so that I could read once again the inscription. And here it is. Well, you will recall the last 20 pages of this being hammered out in the high meadow, England on one side of the lane, Wales on the other, to the sound of battering rams and collapsing damson trees. It is my farewell to youth and North Riding, and I'm afraid it is heavily furnished with the past. And the reference on the last page of the book to Stockin Prestine, 1978, that signifies the place where the camper was parked and the date when he completed the novel on one of his and Halwyn's excursions into the countryside. Well, I thought as I turned out the light and adjusted the pillows in his bed, I'll never get any closer to Carr than this. And it occurred to me that I might actually have met him in the flesh if I had acted on a wild impulse to invite him in secret to that meeting of the Gleaners I had hosted at Malvern College back 20 years before that in 1987, which was 7 years before his death. Carr died in 1994. I was prompted by to actually invite him by one of the few things that I knew about him at that time, and that was that in 1939 he too had been an exchange teacher that resulted in his residing and working in a small town in South Dakota for a year. Knowing that much about exile, would he have come to my assistance? When I had told all this to Mrs. Cox, she smiled and said, that might have been just the sort of thing that would have interested Jim. He might have done it. So, just supposing I had sent him an invitation care of his publisher, I might at least have received a regret with sympathies for my position and my gratitude for my choice of his book. At most, it was a scene right out of a Carr novel, and I went to sleep that night envisioning it. One of those missed opportunities that come only once and are forever afterwards, the subject of wistful recollection and regret. And my image that sent me to sleep was of Carr seated beside me on the couch of the sitting room in Furze Cottage on that cold, snowy January night 30 years before, waiting for the arrival of the Gleaners, each of them furnished with his own copy of A Month in the Country and prepared to extol its virtues, and all of them about to be astonished at the sight of a stranger whom I would be able to introduce as the author. There's something appropriately valedictory in looking back on it all now this way, all the way to 1981 when I first purchased this book and read it for the first time. Over the years, my correspondence with Halewyn Cox kept me up to date for some time on car matters, including news of his son Bob, who had taken over the business of the Quince Tree Press, maps and little books, and of Halewyn's coming to know Byron Rogers and being interviewed by him for his biography of Carr. And she told him about me, and he expressed the wish that we would meet, she said, and shortly after he phoned me up from England. With that and other things in mind, I'd hoped to visit her once again, but then, after some passage of time with no letter from her, I received a short note from Frank Foles in 2011, informing me of her death. He was at her funeral, he said, and Bob Carr, J.L. Carr's son, had spoken of her with great affection and respect. If I was ever planning another trip to Kettering, please let him know so he could get so that Frank Foles and I could get together. But as I mailed my letter of thanks to him for the sad message, he said, I doubted that I would go back, and words from the novel kept coming to mind. Valet, the Latin word which appears at least twice from the novel, kept coming at least twice in the novel as expressions of farewell, and also some of the great closing words. And I quote, "We can ask and ask, but we can't have again what once seemed ours forever. The church alone in the fields, a bed on a belfry floor, a remembered voice, a loved face," end quote. And I was being taken back once again, as I'm sure I will be for the rest of my life, to the novel itself, which initiated the whole adventure. The years of search, the people met along the way, the ordering and transforming power of the great work of art, and the spirit of its creator, which absorb and will outlast us all. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
We do not have time for questions because I
Okay.
need you to get up to chapel.
Really? Okay.